"Sir, the service elevator is this way," 5 words. The porter said them with the particular confidence of someone who believes they are enforcing a rule rather than revealing a bias. The woman beside the man, his wife, his partner of 23 years, the person who had helped him build everything, reached for his hand. She knew that look on his face. She had seen it before. It was not anger. It was something much more deliberate than anger. It was the look of a man deciding exactly what to do with what he has just been shown. 240 employees worked in the Meridian Charleston on that Friday evening. None of them knew that the black family standing in the main lobby with 4 pieces of luggage and a look of quiet, absolute stillness was the reason any of them had a job. None of them had been told. That was the point. Vincent Harper had always believed that the truest picture of what you have built is the one you see when no one knows you are looking. He was looking now, and what he saw would change everything about the Meridian Charleston. Not in the way that scandals change things, not in the way that public relations crises change things, but in the deeper, more permanent way that truth changes things when it finally has no more room to hide. Stay with us, because this is not just a story about a hotel or an elevator or a porter who pointed in the wrong direction. This is a story about what it costs to build something and still be told you don't belong in it. About a woman who knew her husband's face well enough to read the decision being made behind it. And about what happens when the man who owns the building decides. It is time for the building to know it. Vincent Harper was born in 1968 in a small house in North Charleston, South Carolina, the third of 5 children born to William and Estelle Harper. William drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery chain for 34 years, leaving before dawn and returning after dark with the specific, bone-deep tiredness of a man who has given the day everything it asked for. Estelle worked the front desk of a motel on the edge of the city, a small, dated place with 32 rooms and a parking lot that flooded every time it rained, where she checked guests in and out for 17 years with the warmth and precision that the job required and that she brought to it naturally, because warmth and precision were simply the way she moved through the world. Vincent spent significant portions of his childhood in that motel. After school, when his mother's shift didn't end until 6, he would sit behind the front desk doing homework while Estelle worked, watching the guests arrive and depart, listening to his mother handle every interaction, the difficult ones and the easy ones, with the same steady, professional grace. He absorbed things in that lobby, not consciously, not as lessons, but in the way that children absorb the environments that shape them, deeply and permanently, and in ways that take decades to fully surface. He absorbed the specific choreography of hospitality, the way a lobby should feel when you walk into it, the way a check-in interaction should make a person feel seen and welcomed and at ease, the way a problem should be handled so that the guests left the interaction feeling better than before the problem arose. He absorbed the gap between what a hotel claimed to be and what it actually was, because his mother's motel claimed very little and delivered it honestly, while the larger hotels he occasionally visited with his family claimed a great deal and delivered it selectively. He noticed the selectivity. He was 9 years old when he first noticed it clearly, at a hotel in downtown Charleston, where his family had gone for a cousin's wedding reception. The lobby was beautiful in a way that his mother's motel was not, with marble floors and a chandelier and staff in uniforms that matched. But something about the way the staff moved through the lobby, the way attention was distributed, the way some guests were received and others were processed, told a story that the marble floors were trying to cover. He filed the observation away. He was good at filing things away and returning to them later when he understood them better. Vincent graduated from high school in 1986. He was not the most academically exceptional student in his class, but he was arguably the most strategically intelligent, a quality that doesn't always show up on a transcript but that his teachers recognized, and that his mother had always known was there. He received a partial scholarship to a state university and supplemented it with work to jobs. His freshman year, one at a campus dining facility and one at a hotel near the university, where he started in housekeeping and moved, within a year, to the front desk. The front desk was where he wanted to be, not because of the prestige of it. Front desk at a mid-range university area hotel carried no particular prestige, but because it was the point of contact, the place where the institution met the person, the place where everything that the hotel claimed to be either proved itself or didn't. He was exceptional at it. His managers noticed. His guests noticed. He received, in his second year at the front desk, the first of what would become a long series of guest commendations, handwritten notes and survey responses that used words like extraordinary, and transformed my entire experience and the reason I will come back. He graduated in 1990 with a degree in business administration and a clearer sense of direction than most people twice his age. He went to work for a regional hotel company, starting as an assistant manager at one of their properties in Columbia, South Carolina. He was 22 years old. He stayed at that company for 6 years, moving through 5 properties in 4 states, learning every operational aspect of the business from the inside: revenue management, facilities, food and beverage, human resources, the specific, unglamorous complexity of keeping a large property functioning at the level its guests expected. He was good at all of it. He was exceptional at the human parts, the staff management, the guest experience, the culture of a property, the invisible but entirely real quality of a place that made guests feel either welcomed or processed. He could walk into a hotel lobby and know within 60 seconds what kind of place it was underneath its surface. He had been practicing that reading since he was 9 years old in his mother's motel, and 20 years of professional experience had sharpened it into something close to instinct. In 1996, he left the regional company and opened his own. He had been saving since his first paycheck. He had been planning since before that. The first Harper hospitality property was a 40-room boutique hotel in a revitalizing neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina, a converted warehouse building that Vincent had found, negotiated, designed, and opened in 14 months with a combination of his own savings, a small business loan, and the kind of relentless personal investment that turns reasonable timelines into unreasonable ones, and unreasonable ones into finished buildings. The Charlotte property was successful from its first year. Not dramatically, not in a way that attracted immediate attention, but solidly, the way things succeed when they have been built on a clear understanding of what they are and who they serve and how those two things fit together. Vincent had designed the property around a specific guest experience, one that prioritized genuine welcome over aesthetic performance, that trained its staff to see guests as people rather than transactions, that built into every operational system the understanding that how guests felt when they left was more important than how the lobby looked when they arrived. The second property opened in 1999, the third in 2001. By 2010, Harper Hospitality owned and operated 19 hotels across the Southeast, with a reputation in the industry for exceptional guest satisfaction scores and a staff culture that produced unusually low turnover in a business notorious for high turnover. By 2018, the portfolio had grown to 41 properties. The Meridian Charleston, a full-service luxury hotel in the historic district of the city, where Vincent had grown up, was the 40-second. It was his most personal project. He had chosen Charleston deliberately, as he chose everything deliberately, and he had chosen the historic district specifically, the neighborhood of beautiful old buildings and complicated history, the neighborhood where the marble-floored hotel of his childhood memories still stood, where his mother had worked her 17 years at the front desk of a 32-room motel, where the gap between what hospitality claimed to be and what it actually was had first presented itself to his 9-year-old attention. He had spent 3 years developing the property. He had been involved in every detail of the design, the staffing, the training, the culture. He had written personally the service philosophy that every Meridian Charleston employee received on their first day, a document that began, "Every person who walks through our doors deserves to feel that they have arrived somewhere that was expecting them." On the Friday evening in October, when he arrived in the lobby of the Meridian Charleston, with his wife Diana and their 2 adult children, he had not announced himself. He never announced himself on property visits. He had a reservation under his wife's maiden name. He had 4 pieces of luggage. He was wearing dark trousers and a sweater, and the particular invisible quality of a man who has spent his career learning to look like a guest rather than an owner. He had been doing this for 22 years. He had walked into 37 of his 41 properties this way. He had learned something valuable at each one. What he learned at the Meridian Charleston on that Friday evening was the most valuable thing he had learned in 22 years. He learned it in 11 seconds from 5 words spoken by a porter named Daniel Marsh, who was 24 years old and had been working at the hotel for 7 months, and who had been taught by someone or something in his experience that certain guests belonged in certain elevators. He learned that the property he had built most carefully, the one he had invested most personally, the one whose service philosophy he had written with the specific intention of ensuring that every person who walked through the doors felt expected and welcomed. That property had a gap between what it claimed to be and what it was. He had been watching for that gap his entire career. He had found it in other properties and closed it. He had believed, with the specific confidence of someone who has been thorough, that he had closed it here. He had not closed it here. He looked at the porter. He looked at the service quarter. He felt Diana's hand find his. He made a decision. Diana Harper, Diana Reeves, before she married Vincent in 1995, had grown up in Atlanta in a family that was, by the measures most people applied to such things, comfortable. Her father was a dentist. Her mother taught English literature at a private school. They lived in a good neighborhood, took annual vacations, and maintained the specific, careful dignity of a black family that understood, from long experience, that comfort was not the same as safety and that the distance between the two required constant, deliberate navigation. Diana had learned this navigation early. She had learned it in the specific, embodied way that daughters learn from mothers who have mastered something difficult, not through explicit instruction, but through observation, through proximity, through the accumulated example of watching a person move through a world that did not always make space for them with the grace and authority of someone who has decided that the world's failure to make space is the world's problem, not theirs. She had met Vincent at a conference for young hospitality professionals in Atlanta in 1993. She was 24 and working in hotel marketing for a mid-sized company. He was 25 and already running his first property. They had been introduced by a mutual colleague, had talked for 3 hours at a cocktail reception, and had both known, with the specific certainty that arrives rarely and is unmistakable when it does, that something significant had begun. They married 2 years later. Diana left her marketing position and joined Harper Hospitality, initially as the head of brand and marketing, eventually as the company's chief operating officer, a role she had grown into over 20 years of building the business alongside Vincent, of understanding its properties and its people with the depth that only comes from genuine immersion. She was, in many ways, the counterpart to Vincent's specific qualities. Where he was strategic and contained, she was relational and expressive. Where he processed in silence, she processed in conversation. Where he saw the structure of things, she saw the people inside the structure. Together they had built something that reflected both an organization with sound systems and a genuine human culture, with financial discipline and authentic hospitality, with the rigor of a well-run business and the warmth of a place that actually cared about the people it served. She had been on property visits with Vincent dozens of times over 22 years. She knew what they were. She called them truth visits, privately, because that was what they were. She knew how to behave on them, how to stay in the role of a regular guest, how to observe without being obvious about observing. She was good at it, perhaps better than Vincent in some ways, because her natural mode was attention, and she brought that attention to everything around her automatically, without the effort it sometimes cost him. She had seen things on truth visits over the years. Nothing as direct as this. This was the most direct thing she had seen in 22 years of truth visits, but things that had told her something true about the gap between what they were building and what they had actually built. She had always brought those things back to Vincent. They had always addressed them, That was the system. That was how they kept the gap from growing. On that Friday evening in the lobby of the Meridian Charleston, Diana reached for Vincent's hand the moment the porter finished speaking. Not because she was afraid of what Vincent would do. She had never been afraid of what Vincent would do. Because in 23 years she had never seen him do anything that was not measured and intentional and ultimately directed towards something constructive. She reached for his hand because she wanted him to know that she had seen it too. That he was not alone in what he was seeing. That whatever he decided to do with it, she was in it with him. She felt his hand close around hers, firm, still, the stillness of a decision being made. The porter, Daniel, his name tag read, Daniel Marsh, was looking at their luggage with the distracted focus of a person who has completed one task and is preparing for the next, apparently unaware that anything significant had occurred. To him, this was a routine interaction. A family with luggage, a direction given, a procedure followed. He had done it before. In all likelihood, he would have done it again, without this evening's consequence. If Vincent Harper had been someone other than who he was. Vincent looked at the porter for a moment. Then he looked at his wife. Then he looked around the lobby, at the marble floors, the floral arrangements, the staff moving with practiced efficiency through the space, the guests checking in at the front desk with the ease of people who had been directed to the right elevator. He thought about the service philosophy document he had written. Every person who walks through our doors deserves to feel that they have arrived somewhere that was expecting them. He thought about the training programs he had developed and refined over 22 years, about the culture assessments and the guest satisfaction surveys and the management meetings and the 10,000 small decisions that were supposed to add up to a place where what had just happened did not happen. He thought about his mother at the front desk of the 32-room motel, handling every guest with the same warmth and precision. He thought about the marble-floored hotel of his 9-year-old memory, and the gap he had seen in it, and the decision he had made across the following 3 decades to close that gap in everything he built. He had not closed it here. He turned to Diana. "Let's go to the front desk," he said quietly. She nodded. They walked, not quickly, not dramatically, not in the way of people making a scene, but with the measured, purposeful pace of people who know exactly where they are going and why. At the front desk, a young woman named Alicia, 26, 18 months at the property, consistently positive performance reviews, looked up with the professional welcome that front desk training produced. "Good evening. Welcome to the Meridian Charleston. Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "We do," Vincent said. He gave his wife's maiden name. Alicia typed, found the reservation, began the check-in process with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times. Vincent waited until she had completed the process, until she had produced the key cards and explained the amenities, and asked if there was anything else she could help them with. Then he said, "Yes, actually, there's one thing." He reached into his jacket and produced his identification. Not his personal ID, his Harper Hospitality Executive Identification. The card that identified him by name and title. That carried the company logo and his photograph and the words that Alicia, when she read them, caused her professional composure to undergo a rapid and visible recalibration. Chief Executive Officer, Harper Hospitality Group. She looked at the card. She looked at him. She looked at the card again. "Mr. Harper," she said. And then, because training produces speech even when the brain is otherwise occupied, "Is there anything I'd like to speak with the general manager," Vincent said. "When they're available." There's no urgency. There was, in fact, urgency. The general manager's phone rang. 45 seconds after Alicia reached for hers, but Vincent had been precise in saying there was no urgency because he wanted the conversation that was coming to be a conversation, not a crisis. He wanted to think clearly. He wanted the people he spoke to be able to think clearly. Clarity, in his experience, produced better outcomes than emergency. He and Diana took their key cards and went upstairs to their room. He sat down in the chair by the window. Diana sat across from him. Outside, the lights of historic Charleston were beginning to come up in the early evening dark. How do you want to handle it? Diana asked. Vincent looked out the window for a moment. The same way we handle everything, he said. Honestly and completely, Diana nodded. She reached across and put her hand on his. The property is beautiful, she said. The lobby is exactly what you designed. Yes, Vincent said. It is. The gap isn't in the building. No, he agreed. It never is. Daniel Marsh had been a porter at the Meridian Charleston for 7 months. He was 24 years old, a recent graduate of a hospitality management program at a community college in the area, and he had taken the position at the Meridian because it was a prestigious property and he believed, with the optimism of someone who is 24 and has recently completed a program that has told them they are prepared, that it was a good place to build a career. He was not a bad person. This is important to say clearly, because the story of what happened that evening could easily be told in a way that made Daniel Marsh a villain, and that telling would be simpler and more satisfying in the short term, and would miss the most important thing entirely. Daniel Marsh was a young man who had been taught something, or who had absorbed something, or who had arrived at something through the specific combination of experience and environment and unexamined assumption that produces the kind of behavior that feels like procedure to the person performing it and is something else entirely to the person on the receiving end. He had been at the front entrance that evening for 3 hours. It was a busy Friday. The hotel was at 93% occupancy, a level that produced a specific kind of controlled intensity across the property, where everything was functioning but the margins were thin, and the staff was moving with the focused efficiency of people who know they cannot afford a slow moment. He had handled 15 guest arrivals in those 3 hours. He had carried luggage, directed cars, managed the flow of the entrance with the competence that his 7 months of on-the-job experience had built. He had made, across those 3 hours, dozens of small, rapid assessments. This was the nature of the work. You looked at arriving guests and you assessed, consciously and unconsciously, on the basis of visible information and invisible assumption, what they needed and how to provide it. You made these assessments in seconds. You acted on them without deliberation. That was the speed the job required. The assessment he had made when the Harper family arrived at the entrance was wrong. He had made it quickly and without awareness that it was wrong, which was the nature of the kind of wrong it was. It was not a decision he had thought about. It was a reflex, and the reflex had been produced by something, by a set of assumptions, about who belonged in the main elevator of a luxury hotel on a Friday evening in historic Charleston, that he had not examined and could not, in that moment, have told you the source of. He was directed by a colleague to the manager's office 20 minutes after the Harper family had gone upstairs. He was not told why. He sat in the chair outside the general manager's office, a woman named Patricia Walsh, who had been the GM of the Meridian Charleston since its opening and who had, in that time, built a property she was genuinely proud of and waited with the specific anxiety of an employee who knows that being called to the manager's office unexpectedly is rarely a good sign but doesn't yet know how bad a sign it is. Patricia Walsh opened her office door and asked him to come in. She was not visibly angry. Patricia was not a person who led with visible anger, because she had found over 17 years of hotel management that visible anger produced defensiveness, and defensiveness produced denial, and denial was the enemy of the honest conversation that was the only thing that actually fixed problems. She was, however, serious in a way that communicated the weight of what was about to be discussed without requiring her to perform it. She told him what had happened. She told him calmly and specifically, without embellishment. She told him who the Harper family was. She watched his face as she spoke and saw the sequence, confusion, then the specific, dawning comprehension of someone who is understanding a consequence they did not anticipate, then something harder to name. The thing that arrives when you understand not just the consequence, but the action that produced it, and what that action says about you. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I didn't know who they were, he said finally. I know, Patricia said. That's not the point. He looked at her. What is the point? Patricia leaned forward slightly. The point is that it shouldn't have mattered who they were. The point is that every guest who walks through that entrance is supposed to be directed to the main elevator. Every guest, without exception. And you made an exception. Daniel was quiet again. He was thinking. She could see him thinking. The specific interior work of someone who is trying to be honest with themselves about something uncomfortable. I've done it before, he said. I didn't realize I was doing it. I thought I was following the room. What does that mean? Patricia asked. Following the room. He struggled to articulate it. The way certain guests fit a certain space. The main elevator, the lobby. I thought I was reading the room. I thought I was being efficient. You were reading something, Patricia said carefully. But it wasn't the room. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. It was not a disciplinary conversation. Patricia had decided this before Daniel sat down. Had decided at the moment Vincent Harper had said, quietly, that he did not want this handled as a termination. He wanted it handled as a learning. That was his word. Learning. Patricia had written it on her notepad and had felt, hearing it, something about the kind of person she was working for that she had not fully understood before. Despite 7 months of working for him. When Daniel left the office, he was shaken in the specific way that people are shaken when they have seen something true about themselves that they did not know was there. Not destroyed, not defensive. Shaken, which is a condition that precedes either growth or withdrawal, and which can go either way depending on what comes next. What came next, at the Meridian Charleston, was a mandatory all-staff meeting the following morning. And what happened at that meeting would be, for every person present, one of the most significant professional experiences of their careers. The all-staff meeting was called for 8 a.m. Saturday. Patricia Walsh sent the notice to all 240 employees at 11:30 p.m. Friday, after her conversation with Vincent Harper had ended, and she had spent 30 minutes sitting alone in her office, thinking about what needed to happen next. The notice said only, mandatory all-staff meeting, Saturday 8 a.m., main ballroom. Attendance required for all shifts. Mr. Harper will be present. The effect of those 5 words, Mr. Harper will be present, on the 240 employees of the Meridian Charleston, was significant. Most of them had never met Vincent Harper. Some had seen photographs. All of them knew who he was in the way that employees of a privately owned company know who the owner is, as a presence that shapes the culture and the standards and the expectations of their work, without being physically present in it. To know that he would be physically present at an 8 a.m. Saturday meeting, the morning after his unannounced visit to the property, was enough to produce, across the staff, a night of considerable speculation and no small amount of anxiety. They filled the ballroom by 7:55 a.m., all 240 of them, housekeeping, front desk, food and beverage, engineering, security, management. The room that was typically configured for weddings and corporate events held them in rows of chairs, facing a small stage, where a podium stood alone under the ballroom's warm, diffused lighting. Vincent Harper walked onto the stage at precisely 8 a.m. He was dressed as he had been the evening before, dark trousers, a sweater, which was the first thing many staff members noticed, because it was not the attire of a man performing authority. It was the attire of a man who had decided that the clothes didn't need to do any work today. He was enough. He stood at the podium and looked out at his staff for a long moment before he spoke. 240 people looked back at him. The room was very quiet. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you for being here. I'm going to tell you why I called this meeting, and then I'm going to tell you what I think we need to do about it. And then I'd like to hear from you." He told them what had happened. He told it simply, without drama, without the kind of narrative embellishment that turns an incident into a story, and in doing so sometimes loses the truth of it. He said, "My family arrived at this hotel last night as guests. We were directed to the service elevator. That should not have happened." He paused. He let the room sit with it. "I want to be clear about something," he continued. "I'm not here to punish anyone. The person who made that decision has already had a conversation with Patricia, and that conversation is between the two of them. What I'm here to talk about is not what one person did. I'm here to talk about what that one person's decision tells us about this property. Because one person's reflex doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from something. And the something is what I want to understand. Asterisk, asterisk. He looked out at the room. He looked at the faces, the nervous ones, the attentive ones. The ones that showed something that might have been relief at the framing he was providing. The ones that showed something harder to read. I've been building hotels for 22 years, he said. I've opened 42 properties. I've written service philosophies and training programs and cultural frameworks for all of them. And I've made unannounced visits to 37 of those properties to see whether what I build on paper exists in practice. He paused. Last night I found a gap. Not in the building. The building is exactly what we designed. Not in most of what you do. Most of what you do is excellent. And I want you to know that I have seen it and I know it. The gap is somewhere in between. In the space between the training and the reflex. In the place where assumption operates faster than intention. He was quiet for a moment. My mother worked the front desk of a 32-room motel for 17 years, he said. She treated every guest the same. Not because she was told to. Because she understood that the person standing at her desk was a person, not a category, not an assessment, not a risk profile. A person. That understanding was the foundation of everything she did. It is the foundation of everything I have tried to build. He looked down at the podium for a moment. Then he looked back up. I grew up in this city. I grew up understanding that certain spaces in this city had a way of communicating. To certain people that they were welcome and to others that they were not. I built this hotel specifically, this one, in this location, in this city, because I believe we could build something different. A space where every person who walked through the door received the same signal. You are expected here. You belong here. This place was built for you. The room was absolutely silent. Last night, a member of my family received a different signal. And that means the work is not finished. He paused. The work is never finished. That is not a failure. That is the nature of culture. It requires constant attention, constant recommitment. Constant willingness to see the gap and close it. What I'm asking from all of you today is that recommitment. Not as a policy, not as a procedure, as a genuine, personal understanding of why it matters. He stepped back from the podium. I'd like to hear from you, he said. I'd like to know what you see, what you think we're doing right, where you think the gaps are, what you would change if you could change anything. What followed was 90 minutes of the most honest conversation that most of the people in that room had ever participated in professionally. Staff members, housekeeping, front desk, food and beverage, spoke about things they had observed and had not known how to raise, about moments where they had seen the gap and had not felt they had the standing to address it, about the pressure of the job's speed and what that speed did to the quality of attention, about the training they had received and what it had and hadn't prepared them for. Daniel Marsh sat in the third row and said nothing for the first hour. Then, in the second hour, he raised his hand. Vincent acknowledged him. Daniel stood up. He looked at the owner of the hotel he worked in and said, in a voice that was steadier than he felt, I was the person who made that decision last night. The room went very still. I've been trying to understand why I did it, Daniel continued. I've been thinking about it since last night. And the honest answer is that I don't fully understand it yet. I know I wasn't thinking about it. I know it felt like reading the room. And I know now that it wasn't that. He paused. I wanted to say that in front of everyone, because I think that's part of fixing it, saying it out loud. Vincent looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Thank you, Daniel. That took something. Daniel sat down. The room exhaled. The meeting ended at 9:45 a.m. as the staff filed out. Vincent stood near the ballroom door and spoke with anyone who approached him, and many did. Individually, with the specific things they had not said in the group and needed to say directly. He listened to all of it. He took notes. He thanked each person. Patricia Walsh stood nearby, watching. She had been in hotel management for 17 years. She had attended many all-staff meetings. She had never attended one like this. Estelle Harper was 78 years old and lived in the same house in North Charleston, where she had raised her 5 children. The house was smaller than most of its neighbors now. The neighborhood had been through several cycles of investment and reinvestment over the decades, and the houses around hers had expanded or been replaced by larger structures, while hers remained what it had always been, which was exactly enough. She maintained it with the same precision she had brought to everything. The front porch swept, the small garden tended, the interior arranged with the particular, considered order of a person who understands that environment shapes the people who inhabit it. She had retired from the motel front desk at 63, 15 years earlier, after the motel was sold to a developer who converted it into something else, a parking structure. Eventually, which Estelle had observed with the philosophical equanimity of someone who has learned that the things you build don't always outlast the purpose they were built for, and that the purpose itself is what matters. She found out about the Friday evening incident from Diana, who called Saturday morning after the all-staff meeting had ended. Diana told her everything: the arrival, the porter, the 5 words, Vincent's decision about how to handle it, the meeting, Daniel standing up. Estelle listened to all of it from the armchair in her living room, where she sat most mornings with her coffee and the newspaper, a physical newspaper, delivered to the door, because she had never made her peace with reading the news on a screen. When Diana finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How is Vincent?" she asked. "He's okay," Diana said. "He's good, actually. He handled it the way he handles things." "Yes," Estelle said. He talked about you at the meeting," Diana said. "About the motel, about watching you at the front desk." Estelle was quiet again. She looked out the window of her living room at the street, the familiar morning, the oak tree across the way that had been there longer than the house. "He used to sit behind that desk for hours," she said finally, "doing his homework. I used to think he was just doing his homework." She paused. "But he was watching everything. Even then, he said you treated every guest the same," Diana told her. "He said that was the foundation of everything." Estelle made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the soft exhalation of someone who has just heard something that is both true and surprising, even if it is about themselves. "I just did the job," she said. "I did what the job was." "That's exactly what he said," Diana replied. "That it wasn't a philosophy. It was just what you did." After the call, Estelle sat for a while with her coffee and her thoughts. She thought about the motel, the 32 rooms, the flooding parking lot, the guests who came and went across 17 years. She thought about the ones who had tested her patience and the ones who had been easy and the ones she still remembered for specific reasons. The family from Vermont who had gotten turned around and ended up in her parking lot at midnight. The elderly man who had come in every year on the same weekend for the anniversary of something he had never explained. The couple who had checked in with a dog they had promised was not there and whom Estelle had pretended not to notice, because they were clearly going through something difficult and the dog was clearly essential to getting through it. She had treated them all the same, not because she had a philosophy about it, because the person in front of her was a person. And that it always seemed to her like the beginning and the end of the relevant information. After she thought about the hotel Vincent had built. She had visited it twice, once during construction, at Vincent's invitation, when the bones of the building were visible and he had walked her through the space, explaining what each element was meant to do and why. Once after it opened, as a guest, staying in a room on the 8th floor with a view of the harbor that was the most beautiful view she had woken up to in 78 years. She had known, both times, what he was building toward. She had not said so. It was not her way to say the large obvious things, which seemed to her to always need less saying than people thought. But she had known. She had seen it in the building and in the service philosophy he had shown her, and in the specific quality of welcome she had felt when she walked through the lobby. She had also known, because she had spent 17 years behind a front desk and understood better than most people what the gap between intention and reality looked like in a hospitality setting. That building the intention was not the same as closing the gap. The gap required constant attention. It required people who understood why it mattered. It required, most of all, a culture that made the right thing the instinctive thing. Not a rule to be followed, but a value to be expressed. That culture, she had thought, would take time. It always took time. On Saturday afternoon, Vincent called her. He called at the same time he always called, 2 p.m. on Saturdays, without fail, for as long as Estelle could remember. Even when he was traveling, even when the 2 p.m. call required him to step out of a meeting or away from a dinner. It happened. She had never commented on it. It was just a fact of her life, like the oak tree outside and the newspaper at the door. "Hey, Mama," he said. "Hey, baby," she said. "Diana told me. I figured she would. You handled it right. I tried to. You did." She paused. "The young man who said it." "The porter. Daniel," Vincent said. "How is he?" Vincent was quiet for a moment. "Shaken," he said. "Honest about it. He stood up at the meeting and said it out loud, that it was him, and that he's still trying to understand why." Estelle nodded at the phone. "Good," she said. "That's the right place to start. I'm keeping him," Vincent said. "Patricia wanted to know. I told her he stays. We invest in the people who are willing to look at themselves honestly." "Your father would have said the same thing," Estelle said. Vincent was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said softly. "He would have." They talked for 40 minutes, about the property, about the staff meeting, about Daniel, about Charleston, and what it was and what it could be. At the end of the conversation, as they were saying goodbye, Estelle said something she had been thinking since Diana's call that morning. "Vincent," she said. "Yeah, Mama. The motel is a parking structure now, I know. But what I did there, what I tried to do, that's not a parking structure. You've been building that into something for 22 years. She paused. "Don't stop." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "I won't," he said. "I promise." After they hung up, Estelle finished her coffee and looked out the window at the oak tree and the street. In the ordinary Saturday afternoon, moving past her window without urgency, she thought about the 32 rooms and the flooding parking lot, and the person in front of the desk who was always, in the end, just a person. She thought about her son, standing in a ballroom in the hotel he had built, talking to 240 people about why it mattered. She felt, sitting in her armchair in the house where she had raised 5 children, the specific satisfaction of a person who has passed something important to someone, who has done something important with it. It was a good feeling. It was one of the best feelings she knew. 12 months after the Friday evening in the lobby of the Meridian Charleston, Vincent Harper returned to the property for his annual review visit. This one was announced. He had decided, after the previous year's experience, that the unannounced visit had its value. He would continue to make them at his other properties, but that the Meridian Charleston deserved something different. It deserved a visit where the staff knew he was coming, where they had the opportunity to show him what 12 months of deliberate work looked like, where the measurement was not of the gap but of the closing of it. He arrived on a Friday evening, same day of the week. He had chosen that deliberately too. The lobby was as he had designed it, the marble floors, the floral arrangements, the warm, diffused lighting that made the space feel welcoming rather than institutional. He stood for a moment at the entrance and looked at it, letting himself take in the feeling of it the way a guest would, the way his mother would, the way the person who had built it occasionally needed to be reminded that what they had built was real and present and beautiful. Then he walked to the front desk. Behind it stood Daniel Marsh. This had been Patricia Walsh's decision, made in consultation with Vincent, and it had not been made lightly. Daniel had spent the 12 months since that Friday evening in a deliberate process. Mandatory bias awareness training, mentorship with a senior staff member who had been with Harper Hospitality for 8 years, regular conversations with Patricia about what he was learning and what he was still working through. He had been, by Patricia's assessment and by the evidence of his guest satisfaction scores and his colleague feedback, the most changed person in the building. He had asked, 2 months earlier, whether he could move to the front desk, not because he wanted to escape the porter role. He had been specific about that with Patricia. had said explicitly that he wasn't asking for a reward, that he understood the difference between those two things. He was asking because the front desk was the point of contact, the place where the work he had been doing internally needed to be expressed externally. He wanted to be in the place where the message was sent because he understood now, in a way he had not understood a year ago, what the message was supposed to be. Patricia had approved the move. Vincent had approved it when Patricia brought it to him. He had said, reading the request, "This is exactly right." Daniel looked up as Vincent approached the front desk. His expression was professional and warm, genuinely warm. The kind of warmth that is not performed because it doesn't need to be. He had been told Vincent was coming. He knew this moment would happen. He had thought about it for 2 months. "Good evening," Daniel said. "Welcome to the Meridian Charleston. We've been expecting you." Vincent stopped. He looked at Daniel. He heard the words, the specific words, the words from his service philosophy. The words he had written 22 years ago and refined and argued for, and built his business around. "We've been expecting you." He had heard them spoken by his staff hundreds of times. He had never heard them the way he heard them now. "Good evening, Daniel," Vincent said. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. They looked at each other for a moment, the owner and the porter who was now the front desk agent, the man who had built the building and the young man who had made the mistake that the building had not prevented and who had decided, in the aftermath of that mistake, to become someone different. Asterisk, how are you? Vincent asked. "Better," Daniel said simply. "A lot better." Vincent nodded. "Good," he said. "I'm glad to hear it." He checked in. He took his key cards. He thanked Daniel and walked toward the elevator, the main elevator, the one in the center of the lobby, the one with the warm lighting and the marble floors and the floral arrangement visible through its glass doors. He pressed the button. The doors opened. He stepped inside. He looked back at the lobby from the elevator, at the staff moving through the space, at the guests arriving and departing, at Daniel behind the front desk receiving the next guest with the warmth that had been earned, rather than trained, at the building he had designed and built and named after the city where he had grown up, and where his mother had stood behind a desk for 17 years teaching him, without knowing she was teaching him, everything that mattered. The elevator doors closed. Vincent Harper rode up to his room and sat by the window and looked out at Charleston. In the evening light, the harbor, the steeples, the old streets and the new buildings and the complicated, beautiful, ongoing story of a city that was always, like all cities, in the process of becoming something better than it had been. He thought about the service philosophy document, about the words he had written and the words Daniel had spoken, about the gap and the closing of it and the fact that closing it was never finished, and that the never finished nature of it was not a failure but a commitment, renewed every day by every person in every building that carried his name. He called Diana. She answered on the second ring. "How is it?" she asked. "Better," he said. "How much better?" He looked out at the harbor. "Daniel is at the front desk," he said. "He said we've been expecting you." There was a pause. Then Diana said, "Oh, yeah." Vincent said. They were quiet together for a moment, in the way of two people who have built something over 23 years and occasionally, in specific moments, get to see what they have built reflected back at them clearly enough to feel its full weight. "Your mother would like that," Diana said finally. "Yes," Vincent said. "She would." 2 years after the Friday evening in the lobby, Vincent Harper stood before the full Harper Hospitality leadership team at the company's annual conference in Atlanta. It was an audience of 212 people, general managers, department heads, regional directors, corporate staff, the people who ran the 42 properties and whose decisions, multiplied across millions of guest interactions every year, determined what Harper Hospitality actually was, as opposed to what it said it was. He had given this address every year for 22 years. It was always about something specific, a lesson learned, a direction identified, a commitment renewed. The team had come to understand that the annual address was not a motivational speech. It was a reporting, in the truest sense of the word. Vincent reporting to his team on what he had seen and learned and what it meant for the work they were all doing. This year's address was about Charleston. He told the story the same way he had told it to the staff at the Meridian, simply, specifically, without embellishment. He told them about the arrival, the 5 words, the decision about how to respond. He told them about the staff meeting and Daniel standing up. He told them about the 12 months of work and the return visit and the front desk and the words. That had meant more than any guest satisfaction score he had ever seen. He told them about his mother, about the 32 rooms and the flooding parking lot and the front desk, where he had done his homework and absorbed, without knowing he was absorbing it, the thing that had become the foundation of everything he built. He told them that the foundation was not a philosophy or a framework or a training program. The foundation was simpler and harder than any of those things. The foundation was the understanding that the person in front of you is a person. We build systems, he said, looking out at the room. We write philosophies and develop training programs and measure guest satisfaction and track net promoter scores. We do all of these things, and they matter, and we should keep doing them. But systems don't close the gap. People close the gap. People who understand in a real and personal way why the gap is there and what it costs and what it takes to close it. He paused. Last year I found a gap in the property I had built most carefully, in the city I grew up in the hotel I named after that city because I wanted it to mean something specific about what we could build and who we could build it for. He looked down at the podium for a moment. I found the gap, and we addressed it, and the addressing of it produced something I didn't expect. It produced a young man standing at a front desk saying for words that I had written, to the person who had written them, with the sincerity that I had built 42 hotels trying to earn, and had never heard quite that clearly before. He looked back up. We've been expecting you. He said the words quietly. That's what we're building toward. Not the words. The reality behind the words. The genuine, operating truth that every person who walks through any of our doors is expected, is seen, is welcomed. Not as a category. Not as a transaction. As a person. He stepped back from the podium. The gap is always there, he said. In every property, in every industry, in every institution that involves human beings making rapid assessments of other human beings. The gap doesn't close permanently. It closes, and it opens, and it closes again. And the closing is the work, and the work is never finished. He paused. I want this company to be the kind of organization that is always closing, always attending, always willing to see the gap and do the work of closing it, even when the work is uncomfortable, even when it requires us to look at ourselves honestly. He looked out at the room one more time. My mother did that work for 17 years at a 32-room motel that no longer exists. The parking structure that stands in its place does not know that she was there. But I know. And every property this company has built, and every guest who has walked through any of our doors and felt genuinely welcomed, carries something of what she did in that lobby. That is the legacy that matters to me, not the 42 properties, not the revenue, not the awards. He paused. The person at the desk who sees the person at the door. That is what we are building. That is what we will keep building. He stepped back from the podium. The room rose to its feet. In the front row, Diana Harper stood with everyone else, her hands together, watching her husband receive what he had earned, not as a performance, not as recognition, but as the specific, honest acknowledgement of people who understood what was being asked of them and had decided to be equal to the asking. In North Charleston, Estelle Harper sat in her armchair with her coffee and her newspaper in the Saturday morning, moving past her window. She did not know what was happening in the Atlanta conference room at that moment. She would find out when Diana called at noon. She would make the same sound she had made the first time, the soft exhalation, the almost laugh. She would say, again, I just did the job. I did what the job was. And Diana would say, that's exactly what he said. And Estelle would look out the window at the oak tree and the street and the ordinary morning and feel, again, the specific satisfaction of a person who has passed something important to someone, Who has done something important with it? Across the city, at the Meridian Charleston, Daniel Marsh arrived for his Saturday morning shift at 7:45 a.m. He changed into his uniform, clipped on his name tag, and walked to the front desk. He looked at the lobby, the marble floors, the floral arrangements, the light coming in through the tall windows, the first guest of the morning beginning to move through the space. He thought about the Friday evening, 14 months ago, when he had pointed toward the service quarter and said 5 words that he had not examined before he said them and had not been able to stop examining since. He thought about the meeting, about standing up, about the look on Vincent Harper's face when he said thank you, Daniel. That took something. He thought about what it had taken, and what it had produced, and what he was still learning every day, about the distance between a reflex and a value and the work required to cross it. The first guest of the morning approached the front desk, a woman, traveling alone, pulling a single roller bag. She looked tired in the way of someone who has been traveling since early and has arrived finally at the last stop. Daniel looked at her. He saw her. "Good morning," he said. "Welcome to the Meridian Charleston." He smiled, the real smile, the one that costs something and means something precisely because it costs something. "We've been expecting you." The woman looked up. Something in her face shifted, the specific, subtle shift of someone who has just received something they needed and were not expecting to receive. She smiled back. "Thank you," she said. "It's good to be here." Daniel completed the check-in with the care and the speed that the job required. When the woman walked toward the elevator, the main elevator, the one in the center of the lobby, he watched her go and felt, in the ordinary, unglamorous, entirely sufficient way of someone doing work that matters, that he was in the right place. He turned to the next guest. The work continued. It always would. If Vincent and Estelle's story moved you, share it. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been in a place that made you feel expected? Or one that didn't? Subscribe for more stories about the people who build anyway and the people who taught them how. We'll be here.